I think we can start. I would like to invite the panelists to show their face, show face again, put their cameras on, and if you want to speak, then you can turn your microphone on. I'm very happy that at the very last second, Sabine, one of the panel guests, has arrived. Welcome. So we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, distinguished experts and ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first parallel session of this conference, which is on lessons from the response of public institutions to the pandemic. My name is Louis Meuleman. I will moderate this event. I'm a vice chair of the UN Committee of Experts on Public Administration and visiting professor at the University of Leuven, which is in Belgium, not in the Netherlands, as the program says. That's a small difference in neighboring countries, but exactly always with neighboring countries, you have these problems. So it is in Belgium. It is a great university. SDG 16 combines several key conditions for the transition towards sustainability. And having effective, accountable, and inclusive public institutions is the challenge, which is the most universal of all, I think, because public institutions in all countries and at all levels of government need to reinvent themselves on a permanent basis to cater for the problems of now and the future, and not only of yesterday's problems. So institutional quality is therefore like peace, more a verb than a noun. Doing nothing is going backwards. The pandemic has abruptly disrupted the regular functioning of public institutions and affected key government functions and processes, undermining the effectiveness of government action at the national and subnational levels. The need to respond quickly and with drastic measures has added a burden of responsibility on public institutions and created additional risks for institutional processes and organizations. The capacity of public institutions to promote policy integration and policy coherence across the levels of government and engage with stakeholders in society has also been put to the test. And beyond individual institutions, the pandemic has affected whole institutional systems and the way public institutions interact with people. Yet public institutions and civil servants have responded forcefully to the crisis. And there's lots of civil servants, I think, who are proud of that. I was also proud because until 1st January, I worked in the public service myself. So, and there have been innovative ways of working adopted, and there's a lot of resilience and flexibility shown. Well, in this session,
hemos adoptado flexibilidad, hemos adoptado herramientas innovadoras, nuevas métodos
qui ont été établis par les institutions et la possibilité de
public servants.
La innovación de emergencia introducida por la pandemia ahora puede ser aprovechada y también se pueden aprovechar las competencias de los funcionarios públicos. El Comité de los Expertos de la ONU sobre Administraciones Públicas, Administraciones, enseña 11 principios de gobernanza que ya fueron apoyados por la Comisión de ONU en 2018. Es evidente que si un país es capaz de manejar lo complejo, lo imprevisible, un desastre global y consigue...
It depends on the general resilience of public administration. Today we have 4 eminent experts who will kick off the discussion with a short introduction, and they all bring in a different perspective. We will first hear Ms. Sarah Lister. She's head of governance, the Bureau for Policy and Program Support of UNDP. The second speaker is Mrs. Sabine Kuhlmann, chair of political science at the University in Potsdam. The third speaker is Mr. David Stephen. He's senior fellow at the UN Foundation and at the Center of International.
Steven, en la Fundación de ONU, forma parte del Centro de Cooperación Internacional de Nueva York, y el último relator.
Public Innovation Consultancy. And we will organize the discussion in 3 rounds. First, I will invite the panelists to speak. they were given some guiding questions. I hope they will take them into account. Then there will be an interactive dialogue, including time to reply to questions drawn from the chat tool and from the registration forms where people have already addressed questions. Then a final round for the panelists and some closing words to wrap up by me. So for everybody, please use the Q&A function to ask questions. When asking a question, please type your country or organization followed by your full name. As in the plenary sessions, there's interpretation available in English, French, Italian, and Spanish. And that's about it for this start. I'm very pleased to welcome now as the first speaker, Ms. Sarah Lister, Head of Governance Bureau for Policy and Program Support from UNDP. She oversees policy and program support to its governance portfolio globally. And this includes electoral cycle support, parliamentary development, anti-corruption issues, legal identity, youth empowerment, and disability inclusion. And I hope she will also be able to say something about institutions.
Et il va nous parler aussi des institutions.
Espero que pueda hablarnos de las instituciones de la forma.
So that's
questo sia una questione molto importante. Quindi
around 5 minutes or 6. We can be a little bit flexible. Nobody watches this. I mean,
Thanks.
no bad people watch this. Okay, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Louis, and thank you for the introduction and to the organisers for their invitation to participate in this very interesting session, and to the Government of Italy for their continued support to and leadership of Goal 16+. So in the last year, UNDP has indeed supported many innovative practices and tools to support public administration and institutions to be able to function. We could talk about the partnership with the Rwandan Ministry of ICT and Innovation to deploy anti-epidemic robots for use in COVID-19 treatment centers or the airport, to the remote provision of justice services in Argentina, to our work in Brazil to support the parliament to function remotely. There are many such interesting and important examples we could talk about, but in my 5.5 minutes, I would like to just provide perhaps 4 quick broader reflections, which we may then have a chance and an opportunity to talk about. Firstly, I think, we were asked to speak about institutional innovation, and I think we tend to move too quickly to think about technology, particularly in the COVID context when so many of us have functioned remotely. And I think that default position maybe blinds us to many other forms of institutional innovation that we have seen in the last year, including, for example, mutual aid and volunteerism initiatives, which have also been critical in the pandemic response. And we've also seen new relationships between different actors develop, which you mentioned in your introduction as well. For example, between religious entities and health services in some places, using places that engender trust, such as religious buildings, to deliver difficult or complicated things, for example, vaccines in a context of hesitancy. So that's my first point. Secondly, institutional, from what I've seen, although I think we are still very early and we don't necessarily have all the lessons or all the data, institutional innovation of whatever type, I think has worked best to support sustainable development when it's supported known principles. And you mentioned the 11 principles of effective governance approved by the ECOSOC, which are clustered around accountability, effectiveness, and inclusion. And I think the institutional innovation, when it is served to support those principles and other aspects, such as transparency, openness, and so forth, have worked best. So if we're talking about the e-procurement platform in Ukraine that we've developed with the government, or a constituency app that we've supported Bangladeshi MPs to use to ensure that they have access to SDG data, all of these are supporting those principles and can therefore help to support sustainable development. Thirdly, I think from what I've seen, in general, those who've been most quickly able to adapt and respond are those where there were already foundational systems in place. So, for example, Pakistan was able rapidly to scale up its social protection system because it had the National Social Economic Registry in place based on many years' commitment to inclusive provision of legal identity. And we've also seen the importance of sets of capacities and capabilities which support public sector and others to ability to be agile and responsive. And UNDP has just published a paper with Mariana Mazzucato and others looking at some of those capacities and capabilities. Fourthly, and finally, I think there are some areas where we still haven't seen the institutional change that we need to see, although we know from decades of evidence and practice that they are essential for sustainable development. The top of my list is that of gender equality, including gender equality in public administration. UNDP and UN Women recently launched a COVID-19 gender response tracker, which shows significant gaps in women's participation in decision-making related to COVID-19 policies. And gender equality in public administration would be an institutional innovation, which we know would yield results. Secondly, and I'll speed up because I'm using up all my time, another area that we need to continue to emphasize is that of local governance. We have seen local authorities being frontline responders and first points of delivery. A third area is the area of tackling corruption, including public oversight to enhance monitoring and social accountability. And I think there have been some institutional innovations in that area that we might want to delve into more, but I still think it's a critical area that is having a very significant effect on levels of trust in governance systems. And finally, the area of multi-stakeholder engagement and the need for civic space to remain open. And I would just in my closing minute take the opportunity to direct the audience's attention to a recently launched tool between UNDP and UNDESA, which shows how governments and others can review and strengthen their engagement with multiple stakeholders, including in crises such as the current one. So I think in summary, we've seen a lot of institutional innovation of different types. It needs to support existing principles, and there's some areas where we still need to see much more progress made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was very clear and straightforward, and this is printable, you could say. And so we'll come back to the issues, but I think I fully agree with most of what you have said, and it was relevant. The next speaker we go to is the second one is Ms. Sabine Kuhlmann, Chair of Political Science, Administration and Organization at the Faculty of Economic and Social Sciences, University of Potsdam in Germany. She's one of the most influential political scientists in Germany and has a range of affiliations in other countries too. And she recently published an article comparing how different countries have used the opportunities which the pandemic offered, are using this. And I'm sure she will also report in her 5 minutes on this research. Sabine, you have the floor. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this introduction, for inviting me to this panel. Indeed, what I would like to do in my 5 minutes is to draw some, I would say, preliminary lessons from our comparative work on how different countries and different administrative systems have dealt with the COVID-19 crisis, and particularly what their responses were in terms of governance and public administration. And I just want to outline some of the lessons and some of the institutional innovations or approaches countries have taken towards institutional innovation as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic management. The first observation we made is new arrangements in intergovernmental relations, intergovernmental responses to the pandemic, which means that in some countries we observe a predominant trend towards more centralized government, so more centralization, whereas in others there's an emphasis on more decentralized management. And so one lesson we should learn from the pandemic is which kind of intergovernmental relations, which degree of centralization and decentralization is most appropriate to responding to the crisis. And we also have learned that this response depends on the context conditions, on the institutional traditions of countries, and in institutional experiences as well. So from taking the German example, one of the most important experiences was that decentralized management, the important role of local governments, particularly local health authorities, has been a key element in responding to the pandemic and in fighting the crisis. So there seems to be an issue that a strong local level and viable local governments, including local public health services, is an important factor, important element of responding to pandemic crisis. So that's the first, intergovernmental issues, and specifically the role of local governments. The second is the use of data. Increased use of data, including digital tools, digital services. And we have observed all over the countries we included in our studies a push towards more digitalization, towards enabling the public sector using digital tools increasingly. And here the question, of course, is again a certain trade-off we can observe in some countries between increased use of data and data privacy issues. So there's an ongoing debate between privacy issues and the guarantee of data protection, which is a very important issue in Germany too, and the necessity of using data increasingly to fight the pandemic too. And another, a third innovative development concerning institutions is new collaborative arrangements. So what we can see that there are new forms and types of collaborative governance, not only between public institutions, public administration, NGOs, and the private sector. So there is a collaboration, for instance, organizing vaccination, organizing testing centers, and we see here a quite new form of very flexible collaborative arrangement. But also there is a new form of collaboration between politics and science. So policy advice by scientific institutions has gained in new quality, and so the interface between politics, administration, and science has become one of the key elements in the pandemic, and that is something we observe all over the world in all the countries we have in our comparative work, but with very different forms. So there's a debate about the independence of science, the independence of scientists from politics, but also the need of collaboration between these two spheres. So there's, I think, also a very important and interesting field of innovation. Finally, so that's my last point. In many countries, there is a new debate about the rehabilitation of the state and the public sector. After decades of liberalization, new public management, privatization, outsourcing, and a shrinking of the public sector, we observe more and more claims for rehabilitating the state, for a stronger state, or for enhancing the role of the public sector. Taking the health sector, of course, as an example, but not only. So we have seen that a strong and viable public sector is an important response also to the crisis. So and that's it for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also a very clear story, a story which is your introduction is based on research, but it's also very much linking to my findings of my own research and of my conviction that governance is very much context dependent, and the right way to do things depends very much on the history, the culture, the traditions in a country. And I think that also for COVID-19, it applies that when you think about the best responses, then that there is only one rule, and that is a common but differentiated governance is needed. You have common goals to address the pandemic, but you need differentiated governance to find solutions that work in a certain context. Thanks a lot for that. And again, also the science policy interface discussion is an important one. And the last one, I would like to say something about half minute about the rehabilitation of the state, which is an important thing, and I think I'm personally very happy about that. But I got in discussions with people from other parts of the world. I'm from Europe, and you are also from Europe. The feedback that not in all countries this process of making of the state becoming smaller and weaker has been as strong as in a lot of Western countries. So there are different. There have been different movements and transitions in the public administration in different countries, different parts of the world. But generally, it was a very strong point. Thank you very much, and we will come back to this. The third speaker is Mr. David Stephen. He's a senior fellow at the UN Foundation, where he leads a team of partners supporting the UN Secretary General, among others, with developing a program for UNF on the future of multilateralism in the era of COVID-19. So we are very much looking forward to hear your view, David. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a great honor to be invited to this panel and to be at my second SDG 16 conference. I'd like to thank IDLO, the government of Italy. I'm an Italian resident, though not yet a citizen. I hope that will come in the years to follow. And particularly UNDESA, who commissioned the research on which my talk is based as a background paper for this conference, completed with Maggie Williams, who should be probably here in my place, but is on maternity leave. I'm putting a link, if I'm allowed. Sorry. I'm putting a link, if I'm allowed, into the chat to the background paper, and I won't try and cover it all, but focus on one particular issue that we look at. I mean, the paper is really about what we need our institutions to do during this emergency. And one of the arguments is that we need them to actively try and reconstruct the social contract at a time when it's under immense stress. That this is not one emergency, it's three interrelated emergencies: a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and also a crisis of society, of the relations that we have with each other, of our politics, and potentially of our security. And that these crises move at different speeds. And the third one is probably the longest lasting one. It's also the hardest to understand and the least predictable in the way that it unfolds. I think we saw after the 2008 financial crisis a series of consequences for societies that, that took a decade or more to unfold. And I think we'll see something very similar in this pandemic. I mean, the pandemic, I think, don't really have the data in on this yet, but the pandemic is having very complex impacts on people's trust in societies. And I think we see this happening in two quite different directions. First of all, we have the questions that I think both Sabine and Sarah have touched on very well about whether institutions are seen to deliver. And I think this affects people's positive feelings of trust or not trust in institutions. But there's also those darker, deeper, negative feelings of distrust when you just decide the whole system is corrupt and is against you. And that's driven not just by failures of delivery, but when governments are corrupt, when they fail in accountability and in transparency. And together, this trust crisis can fuel the kinds of exclusion, the high levels of grievance that create the conditions for really quite difficult times for societies. So I think we're wanting our institutions to stand up to that and try and do something about it. Now, in the paper, we don't try and look at all aspects of the social contract, but we focus on three emblematic dimensions. First, social protection as an enabler of participation, a kind of badge of entry to the social contract. Second, the space for dialogue and participation, the dimensions of political inclusion that we've heard about from both of the first two speakers. And then thirdly, the aspects of corruption, as I've said, that play such a great role in driving distrust and in reducing the citizens and people's willingness to work with the state. On the first, on social protection, we've seen a massive new investment in social protection systems, much higher than in the 2008 financial crisis. Towards the end of last year, we were already up to $243 per capita of additional expenditure across 200 countries and territories, according to the World Bank data. Now, most of those measures are temporary. They have been designed in many cases to reach out to people who were previously excluded, to reach informal workers, for instance, here in Italy, to reach to non-citizens, to immigrants, whatever their status. But the key question is, can that be sustained? Will the tap get turned off as it did after the 2008 crisis in a period of austerity? Or will countries use this opportunity to try and build something that is both universal and sustainable? That's the big question. On the political inclusion front, I think, as Sabine has said, we have seen this flowering of citizen participation. We've seen in many societies both the grassroots and local governance structures really rise to the challenge that COVID has posed to them in the health, in kind of various economic areas such as food provision, in providing services, and just keeping the society functioning. But against that, we've seen a significant closing of civic space, partly, quite innocently because of the lockdown restrictions, making it harder for people to go out on the street and demonstrate, but often not so innocently, where governments have used the emergency measures to close down the types of protests that they're not willing to hear. We see that as a dangerous trend. We see social movements trying to break out of those shackles, Black Lives Matter and SARS in Nigeria, etc. But we are left, as with social protection, of the longer term question. Will governments roll back the restrictions? Will they find ways for citizens both to participate and to protest when they're not happy? And will they continue to experiment and innovate in ways of bringing the grassroots and local governance actors into the picture? Third and finally, for me, a particularly worrying area is the problem of corruption. Something that is a result of low levels of trust and then weak governance, and then fuels that distrust and further weakens and erodes governance and social cohesion. A response like this creates massive new opportunities for corruption. I am confident, I would lay a large bet that if we come back to this conference in 10 years' time, we will find that countries are still dealing with the consequences of corruption episodes that had their roots in the pandemic response. And we know that this is absolutely toxic to the social contract. Our research shows that anti-corruption bodies have not tended to be central to the pandemic response. It shows that the procurement, understandably, in many cases, has been done at high speed, but with few checks and balances. And it shows that other actors for accountability, including parliaments, have not been able to play a clear role. So then the question is, again, the longer term question of what policies countries are going to put into place to respond to episodes of corruption that have already happened, to rebuild the trust in society that there is accountability for mistakes of the past, and to clean up their systems. I'm far out of time, so let me just end by looking at the international dimension, because we're at an SDG 16 plus conference, and the beauty of SDG 16 plus is it's created a platform for countries to come together to work on problems in a shared way. I think there's a clear international agenda here. First of all, what kind of support is there going to be for universal social protection systems? What kind of policies are there going to be on short-term debt relief and long-term debt sustainability, so that social protection systems aren't just destroyed by periods of austerity? And what kind of policies are we going to put in place to tackle shocking inequities in things like vaccine availability? This is somewhere where the international community has a clear ability to step up and support the social contract in countries. Second, promoting political inclusion. Again, how are international actors going to support civil society, going to support civic space, and going to support innovative methods of enabling citizens to enter in a very different dialogue with their institutions? And finally, the question of whether governments, the more vulnerable governments, are going to have the fiscal space that they need to continue to deliver to their citizens. I'm deeply worried that a very large number of public institutions are basically bankrupt at this point in time, and the bills are only just becoming due. So what are the IFIs, what are the other international institutions that have the economic governance tools going to do to stop that happening and prevent countries being put into a position where the social contract will be placed under pressure that they're unable to bear? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you were well in your time, because I stopped counting, and that's sometimes a little trick. I'm a long time civil servant. I know all the tricks to make ourselves happy. But thank you very much. I will go to the next, the last speaker in the panel, Juan Manuel Roa, president of DINTRA, where he helps government organizations and public administrations to be more transparent and open, directing them towards a clear citizen approach around open government values. That's quite a challenge, and so I was wondering how many governments are willing to do this. I immediately have to think, I'm sorry, of the first episode of the BBC series Yes Minister, from the 1980s of the last century, and the first episode was called Open Government. And then the permanent secretary explained to a younger assistant of the minister, look, this is all nonsense, open government. You can either be open or you have government, or you can have government. It cannot be reconciled. And I'm sure there will still be one or two people in powerful positions in ministries who think the same. But please tell us your story. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from Spain. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this conference from our position in the civil society. We are a humble organization that works to improve transparency and good government from 2012. In the framework of this session, I would like to focus my introduction into topics. The first question is, what are the effects or the impact of COVID-19 on policy-making processes? From our point of view, the reduction of public policy decision circles, the reduction of the control processes of legislative institutions, the setback of the opening processes of government and administration, lack of participation of citizens and civil society on policy-making processes, decreased levels of general public participation, lack of transparency, definitely a stop in the implementation of open government. The second question is talk about anti-corruption during and after ensure COVID-19 response. for an efficient and effective recovery. From our point of view, the best tool and antidote to fight against corruption is transparency, no doubt about it. Also, transparency is one of the principles of open government. It's probably the most important principle because without transparency, it's not possible to create a real open government. It's not possible the participation of citizens and civil society. Transparency is the first step to open gov development model. In our opinion, current data show there was a regression in information access right, open data and transparency from the beginning of pandemic. With the new COVID regulation and laws, accountability process have been interrupted in many cases, and the government became closed. Data show us that the number of citizen information demands have grown during the pandemic without no response. Citizens and social organizations want to know what happened with government matters like public contracts, health data, decision-making policy processes, and most of them find closed doors. Democratic governments have regressed since the pandemic began. And what we did from DINTRA. DINTRA is a non-profit organization. It's a citizen-driven transparency evaluation platform. What we did at the beginning of pandemic, when we detected the decrease in transparency in the first month of the pandemic, we detected the lack of international standard to evaluate the response of governments and the few indicators and data that government published. We detected that in the case of Spain, where we were international, but in this last year, more here in Spain, there was an information chaos in the 3 government levels, and the confusion was increasing, transparency declined, and public information was poor. So we create a COVID transparency index in collaboration with the public health institutions, with the collaboration of the most of the regional government and with the Spanish government. We create a standard to measure the transparency level in the COVID pandemic crisis. We create an index in common with health institutions with 40 KPIs divided in 4 categories: health resources transparency, COVID data transparency, strategies and action to reduce COVID impact, and economy transparency data, dividing in COVID public spending, public contracts, extraordinary regulation, public grants, public donations. We collaborate with the regional government to improve the COVID transparency data, and together we create a standard to measure. Most of this regional government work to improve the COVID public data and connect with the citizen and social actors. The methodology is citizen-driven, can be audited or checked by the citizen. The method is also dynamic and force government to keep data updated in real time. The strategy was created ranking with the government transparency levels that generate many impact on media and press. And the result was the overall growth in transparency level was 36%. We are really happy with the result and with the response of our governments to try to connect the public data with the citizen, no, and with the society in general.
Sorry, thank you very much. That was also around 5¼ minutes, more or less. And that was a very different view, which makes the discussion only much richer already. And it's very important to see that and to hear you speak about this. And we will come back to that. We have now had 4 short introductions, and I would like now to come back to the panelists with let's say starting with 2 questions, and then each of you can decide which one, or if you want to take both. There was another question addressed directly in the chat box to David, and you have answered this already about the availability of comparative studies. Thank you very much for that. There is a question I would like to address, which is posed by David Leblanc from the UN DESA Secretariat. What institutional lessons do you learn from countries that seemed to perform well during the first wave, but were massively affected by subsequent waves? And we've seen quite some examples from that. So what institutional lessons can you learn from that? And another question that was already earlier posed is shorter but also complex. What institutional capacity is needed to respond to COVID-19? And capacity, I would here like to translate in things like the skills, the mindsets, the capacity, the capability also to do the right thing. So these are 2 questions, one on the capacity, capabilities, and the other one on institutional lessons for this dual approach situation where countries performed very well in the beginning and later not anymore. Who of you 4 would like to take the floor? Can I see a physical hand or something? Sarah, you're prepared, absolutely. Please go ahead.
I'm not, but often it's easier to be the first because then you have the range of things you can say. It's so much easier. I could take I could come back on the what sort of capabilities if you want, but I'm intrigued by the question actually, which I think is a really interesting question about what lessons can you learn from those who do well in the first round and then don't do so well. And I have to confess that it's not something that I've studied the data on, and it's not something that I've explicitly thought about, but I think it's a super interesting question. And I think it points to what we are talking to, and actually almost all of the panelists talk to, about some of the core governance and democratic governance systems and principles of accountability and inclusion and effectiveness, and the necessity of having those embedded in governance delivery, and ensuring that the spectrum of institutions are functioning well. So as I mentioned, and David and others mentioned, the role of the anti-corruption institutes, the role of the parliaments, the role of the other entities whose job it is to consider over a longer period how public institutions are performing, because you can some with stronger capacities for service delivery can scale up, but the longer term implications require the oversight and the embeddedness and the inclusion and the multi-stakeholder aspects and the multi-level aspects, the ability to integrate your national and your local delivery. So I think it speaks to the need for a sort of integrated whole of government and whole of society response to it. And my guess is that when we look at the data, that is what will come through, but it is just a professional hunch at this point, and I'm interested to hear what others might say.
Thank you. But this only applies to probably to countries that have already relatively well developed institutional systems. There are many countries who don't have that, and they may have been lucky in the first round and not in the later phases of or the other way around.
But I may say it also points to what development actors should be potentially supporting in the response. So I think a year ago, there was a lot of emphasis on, procurement of PPE and so on and so forth. And some of us governance folk were saying, hang on, we need to be talking anti-corruption. We need to be talking inclusion. We need to be talking accountability and transparency and all of those aspects as well. I think there's a much bigger recognition of that now. And I think we have seen scaled up efforts on that, but I think that's the direction that it's sending us in. That it's not just a quick emergency response that's needed here. it's including it's ensuring a more systemic response.
Thank you. Sabine, you are holding up, I think, 5 fingers I can see, but that means that you really need to say something.
Thank you very much. Yes, I would like to take up the first question on what were the lessons learned by countries who were performing well in the first round or first wave, and much worse in the second wave. And I think Germany is one of these countries, but there are others too. And so what did they learn? What were the institutional responses? So I would like to refer to these institutional responses. And I think one of the institutional responses we could observe, especially in countries where there is a high degree of decentralization and local autonomy and a high degree of fragmentation in the institutional system, those countries have responded by intensifying coordination mechanisms. So more coordination in the intergovernmental system, more coordination between levels of government, more coordination between sectors. So in enhancing, increasing, intensifying coordination, I think was one of the major lessons. However, empirical evidence shows that this coordination didn't always work well. So there were attempts at increasing or trying to have more and better coordination, but it didn't always work well. So therefore, it's maybe also a question mark. So what actually works and what didn't work, but the necessity was perceived and was accepted that this coordination is important. Another thing related to this increased coordination and sometimes even more hierarchization, more centralization in these countries where the second wave was bad, so more centralized steering, but at the same time, at least an attempt of having local experimentation. So experiments to try out some innovative things, have some projects or experiments in, let's take an example, how to reopen the society without endangering health issues. So how can we reopen the society? So there have been local experiments. So I think this was also something connected with the increasing degree of centralization. So how can we regain the local? How can we re-strengthen the local in this context? That's maybe something important. And then a third element, an increased importance of comparisons. So those countries which have experienced a bad second wave have increasingly looked around to other countries. And what can we learn from these other countries, even in very remote contexts? That's something sometimes strange for a comparativist to see. Why do we compare to Thailand in Germany or to other remote regions where we normally do not have such kind of comparisons? So the comparative view was also from a political perspective a very important one. That's maybe also one of the lessons or the reactions in these countries.
Have you seen, Sabine, a public institution that is that looks like my dream organization, which can do everything, can switch between top-down, then switch to collaborative approaches, then do efficient market approaches? That's what is called meta-governance, playing with different approaches, but in the first place, understanding all these different approaches and knowing how to use them.
I don't think that we have an ideal type model, and I would also say there's no ideal type real life model, so that there's no country or setting. I think if there is a certain degree of flexibility in the system where you can shift from centralized to decentralized, and we experienced that in Germany too. this kind of flexibility and reactivity helps to reshuffle tasks from one level to the other if necessary, and then to adapt again. So sometimes this produces transaction costs, because you then need to decide, you need to reshuffle, you need to find solutions, many actors involved, they need to make decisions. So transaction costs, costs of collaboration and of negotiation are high. But I think the model and the system is then more agile and more flexible. And so I think degrees of institutional flexibility, agility, that helps.
Okay, and this we could. I should not be discussing here because, but a last thing that is coming up and that could help also is the increased attention for foresight methods and foresight thinking about different futures and what would be your response in different futures. But let's go to David. Would you like to comment on one or two of these questions?
Yeah, I think it's like Sarah, this is maybe a slightly, instinctive response, but I've been struck from the beginning of the pandemic by a certain lack of humility in our response. We were hit by an emergency that had obviously been predicted, but then hit in ways that were not expected. We did some interviews with planners who planned for pandemics, and for instance, they massively underestimated the economic disruption that a pandemic would cause. And these were not stupid people; these were people who thought seriously about the problem and used many of the foresight mechanisms that you're talking about, Louis. And then countries that did well in the first wave, I think, massively overinterpreted their success. They told a number of kind of just so stories that because they'd been successful, then the various things that they've done must have been incredibly effective. And in fact, in many cases, luck played a role, how the virus had dispersed before measures came in, the kind of sequencing, geographical factors, possibly, patterns of, how immune societies were, what kind of exposure they'd had to similar viruses in the past. We still don't know a lot of this stuff. And I think it's very difficult to do, particularly in the modern media environment, which is incredibly unforgiving to politicians and leaders who express on uncertainty. But it needed leadership that was able to talk within the system and then externally about how little was actually known, and how that requires a very kind of subtle strategy that's very adaptive to the uncertainties. And I think very few countries have managed to get that right, and very few countries have managed to sustain that over time. I've noticed in a lot of countries the debate has become increasingly bad-tempered, say between the national and regional or local actors over time. The alliances have broken down. I really worry about this for the lessons that we're going to take for the future. We're already beginning to get some of the big reports. The experts, the great and the good, get together for the big panel on what we did wrong and what we should do in future. And I think if there is a similar lack of humility, then there will be a tendency to draw very simplistic lessons. If we just spent a bit more money, if we just done X or Y, then it would all be okay. And we'll then end up hitting a slightly different crisis, and we will fight the last war. And we will be in a similar position where countries like the UK and the US were right at the top of the indexes about how well prepared they were, and actually found out that they weren't prepared. So I'm not sure humility is a term that's much used in kind of governance debates, but maybe we should introduce it a bit more.
I fully agree with that. I must immediately think of the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who was so proud in the first round that his lockdown was the best lockdown ever, because it was an intelligent lockdown, he said. He called it an intelligent lockdown. And that's something about the lack of humility, maybe. Juan, are you there? And would you like to come in on this? Maybe that we lost you, Juan, for a moment. Then we'll come back later. There are two new questions in the Q&A box, and I would like to again take them both, and then you panelists, you make something out of it. And the first is from Cristiana Carletti, Italy. Which kind of measures, legislative, administrative, procedural, and so on, operational, socio-economic, yet applied by the public, central and local governance, could be preserved even if adopted beyond the health emergency? So there are lots of innovations, things that happened, measures that have been taken that were never taken before, and because of the exceptional circumstances. And what kind of measures will survive the pandemic, you could say it like that. And the second question is from Alok Gaurav, assistant professor of public administration in India, Central University of Karnataka. And the question is, what collaboration measures shall be applied to address the COVID pandemic in reference to quasi-federal system of government? Not completely clear to me, but I think that is a question on the on the central decentral line, I think, and on collaborative governance. Who can I give the floor on one of these questions? Which measures will survive? Sabine, please go ahead.
Well, I think I could give it a first try. Measures which will survive. That's basically one of the major questions we treated in our special issue on the COVID-19 crisis as a window of opportunity, using the crisis as an opportunity. And that, of course, can be for the better or for the worse. So the crisis could be an opportunity to achieve improvements and to hopefully maintain these improvements, preserve them for the non-crisis periods. But it could also be an opportunity to worsen institutional settings, to some more negative impacts, which could also survive. So then, in the end, it's a normative question: what do we want to preserve, and what do we want just to be a crisis mechanism? And so that's, of course, to be decided by societies and by politicians. So what are measures or elements to be preserved, or which are likely to be preserved? So I think one major element is the usage of more digital tools. So I think really in all countries, this crisis has been a trigger and really a push factor for digitalization. And so for the public sector, again, taking the example of Germany, that now public health services, local public health authorities are working on a digital basis. That's something that will survive, and that should probably survive. So I think this increased possibility of digital service delivery is something to be preserved. Another element is more flexible solutions in public services. So what we have observed as well is that in those countries where there is a strong tradition of bureaucracy, of bureaucratization, of regulation, of intense regulation, administration in the crisis has worked more pragmatic, less bureaucratic. There have solutions have been found to act less bureaucratic, to be more responsive, to respond to the crisis. And so I think to some extent, these less bureaucratic procedures will be preserved, but countries or governments have to take decisions to preserve these procedures. And so whether less bureaucracy and less bureaucratic solutions, whether they will survive is also a question of political decisions to be taken.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's maybe two elements where I think it could make sense to preserve them.
Thanks very much. I see, Juan, you are back. We lost you, and you're right, I'm living in the countryside. I hope you can, are you able to speak again? Or not? Then we first continue with one of the other two. Yes, Sarah, please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I could pick up where Sabina left off, because I think that point about flexibility is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And I think we've also seen it in relation to political institutions and political processes. So part of the portfolio I oversee is around electoral support, parliamentary support, and those aspects. And certainly this time last year, there were a lot of discussions about how do you keep any of those processes and functions running. And the timing of elections will always be a matter for national authorities. But in the UN system, we spent a lot of time looking at, how do we actually conduct elections and support elections at times like this, across the range of voter registration, political support to ensuring political campaigning can take place, and those, what recommendations can we make to national authorities on that? So I think across the range of also the political institutions, there's been quite an interesting discussion about what are these core principles that we need to preserve. And how do we ensure that even in extreme circumstances, some of these aspects can continue to be supported? And I think that that's also a welcome discussion in terms of thinking how we think about democratic systems of the future, which I know is not the focus of this discussion. But I think rather than being necessarily tied to very procedures that have been in place for decades, a look at how do we preserve the principles in new ways. And then I think there's one aspect that I think has come to the fore that I don't think has been tackled properly, but that we will need to address is, I think, maybe David mentioned, somebody mentioned it, is the information space aspect. Misinformation, disinformation. Mm-hmm. This was clearly an enormous issue for the functioning of societies before the pandemic hit, but I think it's hit public attention and the attention of public authorities. And I think we will see scaled up efforts in relation to that, and already interesting discussions at multilateral regional level about the types of responses that are needed for that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. David, please come in.
Yeah, so build on both of those interventions on what will survive or should survive, which are obviously different.
It's both possible.
Yeah, but they're very different questions. I think, I hope anyway that we're going to start to think seriously about what being prepared for an emergency looks like, and what resilience during an emergency looks like as well. I mean, the vaccine story has both been astonishing and terrible in a way. I mean, the speed with which vaccines became available was much, much faster than would have happened even 5 years previously. And that is largely due to the response to previous health crises. We saw vaccines being developed on platforms that were developed for MERS, for SARS, for Ebola, etc. And I think we have a realist. I mean, I think it was 323 days to the first vaccine, and we have a realistic prospect of cutting that down to 100 days. But then we've seen that the manufacturing and distribution infrastructure simply wasn't in place to get those vaccines fast enough to where it's needed. So how do we pre-build that kind of manufacturing capacity? I think similarly on the, and that's just one example, but I think we need an audit across our institutions of what being prepared looks like and how we actually invest in preparation. I think on the resilience question, I've been surprised at how little curiosity there has been around what parts of society did keep functioning, why that happened, and how they kept basic systems running. I mean, I can't remember the questioner's name, but she was in Italy. I live in central Italy. This is a part of the country that's very well known for having a large number of small food shops. I think we have 50 food shops in my city. We were never short of food. Whereas in the UK, I had friends who spent their days driving from supermarket to look at the empty shelves. That is an institutional resilience plumbed into this city. Now, it's also an institutional resilience that the big food companies, the big supermarket companies, are doing their very best to try and strip out as quickly as possible. This area of Italy is earmarked for investment by supermarkets that think they can drive the small food shops out of business. In fact, 6 supermarkets have opened in the city in the last 3 years. So, and again, it's just an anecdote, it's just a single example, but are we going to look at what keeps food flowing, what keeps trade systems running, how we manage to keep some kind of education going for some children in this crisis, and invest in that kind of resilience? Or are we just going to go back to some kind of business as usual and allow that resilience to ebb away? So those would be my 2 areas, preparation and resilience, that I'd really think that institutions need to think about seriously.
Yeah. I think meanwhile, David Leblanc will be very happy about the broad range of answers he got. So that I can write a nice paper on it now. There is one question that was one of the guiding questions, and I think we did not really address it. When I'm in these kind of discussions, I always like to go back to the 3 main principles of effective governance for sustainable development, and they come straight from SDG 16: effectiveness, accountability, and inclusiveness. And what strikes me a bit is that we discussed a lot about issues around effectiveness and also about inclusiveness, collaboration, trust, and so on, but not so much about accountability. Is there something useful to say about how can national accountability systems in post-pandemic world benefit from insights gained during the pandemic in terms of collaboration among institutions and with stakeholders? I mean, would this lead, for example, to more diversity in accountability mechanisms or not? Or have we forgotten about accountability because of the urgency of the crisis? Who would like to say something about that? David, please go ahead.
I mean, Sarah, Sabine almost certainly know more about this than I do, but I've been astonished by how little innovation there has been in accountability. I've seen very few countries that have been prepared to set up an ad hoc body that would review procurement contracts that were having to be made at speed. I mean, that would have been an incredibly simple thing to do, and it would have exported some of the risk of these speedy decisions out to a body that could have reviewed them. I've been astonished by how, I mean, there are examples and good examples, but I've been astonished by how few bodies have set up, how few countries have set up representative bodies of citizens to advise on decision making in the crisis at a time when we desperately needed those kind of deeper democracy solutions. And there were countries that did that, but many fewer than I would have expected.
Mm-hmm.
And I also, again, I'm sure Sarah knows this, and Sabine, many more countries than I do on this, but I see very few countries where the government is actively preparing for the big inquiries that are inevitably going to come. In fact, many of them seem to be trying to resist. I mean, these inquiries are inevitable, but they seem to be dragging their feet and resisting them and trying to, delay that moment of accountability. And again, I think, even during the crisis, government departments could have been beginning to prepare the account of what they are doing in a more systematic fashion, so that there's a more, again, Sarah, tell me if this is ridiculous, but so there's a more kind of collaborative approach between the people who are having to act at speed and the people who are going to come later and hold them to account, rather than this kind of inquisition that I think many government servants are expecting.
I think that's a very good point, and please, Sarah, go ahead, react to that. But this fits also with my feeling that indeed we should have seen maybe more different citizens' involvement in accountability processes than we have. And I'm also afraid that because there was indeed kind of a general lack of accountability, because everything has to be rushed, that we will all lose a lot of time and get a lot of stress and further lack of lose of trust, because of the next years we will cover up all these scandals, which will then be called scandals, of course, and corruption cases in all countries, also in countries where you won't expect it, because where there's too much money, there are always people who find the money in the wrong ways. So, yeah, please, Sarah, what are your thoughts about that?
I'm not I'm always pessimistic, so perhaps therefore I'm less surprised than David. And I think it's too early, actually, and I think I said that earlier, and I think David and others have said that earlier. I think David is right that these big inquiries will come, but I think there's smaller mechanisms that are in some places functioning, and I think in some countries there will be seismic shifts as a result of the pandemic response, and I think we will start to see those playing out in the coming months. And I think Carnegie Endowment produced some analysis recently that said that actually some of what they were predicting a year ago in these terms had not played out as badly as they were anticipating. So I do think that there's a massive issue on accountability. I think there was a massive issue before the pandemic. And I think that there may, in some places, actually be a reckoning coming to corrupt governments and officials that would not have come had we not seen the situation that we have. So that's not to say I'm all, everything's rosy and it's all happy. It's not. It's just that I think the level of incompetence in some places and corruption in others has been laid bare in a way that opens the opportunity for civic actors and so forth, if there is space for them to do so, to be more vocal. But if Juan's back with us, it would be interesting to hear also his perspective on these issues. And I see Sabine waving.
Yes, exactly. So Juan is not yet back, unfortunately, but Sabine will take the floor, and then I have another question to go back to.
I would like
Sabine.
to bring in here the argument of again of different contexts and different administrative cultures. I think that the issue of accountability, which is closely connected also to transparency, has also to do and is connected to countries' traditions and countries' let's say it, transparency cultures, which are existing or not. And as I perceive it from a comparative perspective, for instance, the Nordic countries are much more active already in bringing in transparency to the crisis management, in initiating inquiries, bigger inquiries, initiating evaluations, ex post evaluations of measures, in bringing the results also to the public, what worked well and what didn't work, involving in these evaluations scientists, independent scientists, but also a participatory element. And so there seem to be different traditions or different cultures in the countries dealing with this issue of accountability and transparency. And maybe that's also would be an interesting area of learning from each other, looking at these countries and seeing what we can learn from them in terms of making results, making also failures transparent and accessible for a broader debate.
Okay, thanks a lot. I would like to go back to the question we didn't really address yet, which was posed earlier. The question on capacity and capability in public administrations. So what kind of measures in terms of capability and mindsets in public administration should be taken to create this better resilience against shocks, against crisis, and against the enormous dynamics of the current situation. And because this crisis is one crisis. It's the first recent global pandemic, but there will be more probably, and there will also be lots of climate inflicted crisis, and so we will see more combinations of different crises at the same time. So our institutions in the next 5 or 10 years really need to become more resilient and more agile. And but can we do that? So what is necessary to create that? Are there elements? Are there good examples to mention? Who could say something about that? We have only 3 panelists at the moment, so I really have to come back to the 3 of you. You are now the experts for everything. So,
shall I jump in with a few thoughts, and then the other 2 can. Yes. I mean, I mentioned it in my initial intervention, and I think the issue of gender equality in public administration is really important, and I think there's really interesting evidence and data on how an emphasis on gender equality actually strengthens capacities across the board. And UNDP with partners will soon be publishing a really interesting report, and it's embargoed, I believe, until June, so I wasn't allowed to put any of the data in my initial remarks. But I think that is an area that we have not emphasized consistently enough. But beyond that, I think we've sort of skirted around some of the things that I think they've been implicit in what we've been saying this morning or this afternoon. I think it's around adaptability and learning capacities, ability to interface with different types of actors, so both people and private sector, other networks, multi-level. It's that capacity to engage with different stakeholders at different levels. Sabine mentioned the data infrastructure, the data piece, the ability to use data to inform decision making, and then we've also talked about cross-cutting, the learning aspects, the ability to learn. So those would be, a quick list from me in terms of capabilities and capacities that we need to see.
Fantastic, thanks. Sabine, what is your list, and then David's list?
Yeah, I can list a few further elements probably. So one, this is also what I already pointed to at the beginning. Is the important role of the public sector. I think the awareness has increased that viable public institution, viable public services at various levels of government are a key element of responding to crisis, be it a pandemic crisis or other crises. So the previous trend of shrinking the public sector, of going privately, I think this is a major lesson learned, or we should learn, to have viable public institutions or public services or public service delivery. So that's one element. Within this public sector setting, I think the role of the decentralized and local levels are very important. So besides a strong intervention from the central state, there needs to be a responsive local level and responsive local institutions. Also, what we see in the pandemic specifically, because there's a different regional and local effectiveness of the crisis. So different regions are differently affected by the crisis, and therefore local tailor-made responses are important. And that's also an element of flexibility and responsiveness. And then a final element is training and education of civil servants. So what I see also is that specifically in those countries where there is a predominance of legalist training of the public sector, there is a quite narrow-minded approach sometimes to develop functioning rules, pragmatic rules, to be a bit more pragmatic and flexible. So we also need for the public sector a new model of education and training for civil servants, for the younger generation. I think that's also an important element of resilience and of being responsive to crisis.
I fully agree to that. I always like to tell people and people are surprised that in Germany, maybe still 70% of civil servants in ministries are lawyers. In the Netherlands, it's maybe 25 or 20%. And lawyers think of different solutions for the same problems than non-lawyers or than engineers or others. And that makes it fascinating. So the mix of disciplines is important. But do you hope, and that's why I wanted to come back to that, do you expect or hope that because there's a broader awareness about the importance of public administration, that will also then again attract more people or different kind of people who want to become a civil servant, not just because the job is so secure, but also because of the complexity of the task and the importance of the tasks.
Yes, I think the public sector will regain more attractiveness. I think it could, but it also depends, of course, on whether recruitment procedures are adopted, whether there are more innovative elements of recruiting people. It depends also on training, on education at universities, and all these elements have to be combined in order to make the public sector more attractive. So there's a mix, I think, a mix of different components where innovation is needed. Yeah.
Great. David, your list.
Well, I really just want to build on what Sabine has just said, because I think, sorry, just excuse me. I think if we were over in the justice panel, I'd be talking about how the big shift that we've seen in the justice sector in recent years is this move away from thinking about institutions in the abstract to thinking about what justice problems actually look like in people's lives, and using data and evidence to understand those problems and then to try and solve them in an innovative and cost-effective way. So a people-centered approach, and I'm repeatedly, and that's, I think increasingly accepted, and you see that in a growing number of areas. You see a big shift in education to try and understand, what quality outcomes children are getting out of education systems. Very few often, but at least that question is now being more commonly asked. I very rarely see that reflected back into the institutions. that are required to deliver. Very rarely see the people-centered approach taken into those institutions. You know, we need, I think, 70 million new teachers globally during the rest of this decade. If we're to fix the, you know, just the dreadful mess that the world's education systems are in, it's going to happen because, as Sabine said, those 70 million teachers are recruited in new ways, trained in different ways, valued very differently, incentivized and motivated in new ways. That is the big opportunity. They're almost all going to be young, and I don't see a systematic attempt to think about how to do that effectively. And that's just one public sector group. I think South Africa has 1.2 million full-time equivalent public servants. Does the government think systematically about how to deploy those 1.2 million people, how to make them the face of government, how to rebuild their interaction with the people that they serve, how to make sure that they are valued? No, I don't. I mean, I'm not picking on South Africa, but you know, it's just one example. I happen to have the figures in front of me. But I don't think the governments tend to think about the public service in that way. So I think this decade needs to be the decade of rebuilding public service, rebuilding public servants, and repositioning them in our societies. And unless we're prepared to do that, then we end up with a lot of technocratic fixes that, you know, help. Technology platforms obviously help, but they don't get to the heart of the problem, the people that we employ to help our societies function effectively.
Fantastic. These were nice, almost closing words already. And that's very appropriate because we are almost at the end. We have 4 minutes to go until the end of the session. And I will not give a summary, but just a few topics because this was a very rich 1.5 hour. And if I order the topics a bit around effectiveness, accountability, and inclusiveness, then we discussed about science for policy, science-policy relations, the use of principles of effective governance, the discussion between centralization and decentralization, corruption issues, learning from other countries, certain flexibility that is needed, and shifting between top-down and bottom-up is good. The whole resilience discussion, the use of digital tools, but also social innovation, moving to flexible solutions, bureaucratic has happened, and that's something that could also stay. This is all about effectiveness of institutions. On accountability, we came only later on that. Juan mentioned the COVID transparency index that they developed in Spain. The lack of accountability we have seen in the crisis so far. The issue that transparency is part of public administration culture, and it's there or it's not there. The big differences. The issue of mis or disinformation and messing around with data, messing up data is an issue that came up very strongly during the crisis. And non-inclusiveness, investment in social protection is important. The intergovernmental relations, improving of that. There were more collaborative agreements. In the beginning of the discussion, we talked a lot about collaborative approaches, and that is it's an important thing, I think, also because if you look at principles for effective governance or for good governance, they are usually about effectiveness or accountability, but not about inclusiveness. And that's the big difference of the ECOSOC or UN-DESA or SEPA principles, where there are 5 of the 11 are on inclusiveness. Seems very important to me. I think we should come to a close. Is there anything, one thing one of you 3 or all 3 wants to shout out is like this we didn't deal with, and it's important. One last word for each of you. Sabine. Microphone, yeah. You're muted.
Yeah, now?
Good.
Can you hear me now? Well,
yes.
a final plea for rehabilitation of the public sector and of the important role of public institutions and modernization of civil service training. I think some of the elements we pointed to. Thank you.
Great final line. Thank you. Sarah, what is your cry?
I'm busy posting resources in the chat box, but I think if people wish to think more about the capabilities aspect, we have another event tomorrow looking at that. And I've said it twice, I'll say it a third time, the gender equality and public administration, and I'm about to post the tracker tool as well.
And David, you already made your closing statement about that we need now the decade of rebuilding the public service, but you could add a second afterthought to that now.
I think I'd only say what I started with, which is that the social dimensions of this pandemic are only just getting going, and we must not expect this to be over in a year or two. This is a 10-year a 10-year attempt to rebuild institutions, protect the social contract, and respond to this crisis. And if we switch off, I think societies are really going to be in trouble. If we don't, then we've got an opportunity for renewal.
Okay. Thank you very much. This was a really, really rich discussion, and I hope somebody has taken notes, because there's almost a whole book in this. I want to thank all the panelists, the participants, the offices in Rome and New York who gave important support and all the preparation, and of course the interpreters who have tried to make something of what we said. I wish you a very fruitful continuation of the conference tomorrow. And again, thanks very much. This was a big pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.